Welcome back to Financial Fortitude, where we help you build a life you can enjoy today while planning for a confident future.
And today's episode is a heavy one, but an incredibly important one.
We're talking about what to do financially after the loss of a spouse, and more importantly, what not to do.
Because here's the reality. This is one of the most emotionally overwhelming seasons someone can go through.
And yet, it's also a time where people feel pressure to make big financial decisions quickly, when in reality, that's usually the worst thing you can do.
So today, we're going to walk through a better framework, one that prioritizes clarity, stability, and protecting the surviving spouse.
And ultimately, how good financial planning before this moment can make life dramatically easier after it.
Welcome to Financial Fortitude, a podcast for high earners, families, and business owners. We're your hosts, Michael Acosta
And Brady Hemmerly. Each week, we bring purpose-driven financial guidance to you so you can be assured you're on the right path. If you're looking to become an extraordinary wealth builder, let's dive in. Michael, this is probably one of the fewer episodes that perhaps I'm not as excited to talk about, but generally, I would say it's very important that we have this discussion because loss, unfortunately, affects all of us at some point or another, and prior planning typically prevents emotionally charged decisions and perhaps financial mistakes, and that's really why we're here to share this type of information with listeners.
No, of course. And I was curious if you were going to start this off with saying how excited you were. But, for me, I would say that it's still relatively an exciting topic, not so much because of the joy it brings, but more so because of the good that it can actually provide to all of our listeners, right? To be more proactive because, we've harped on it before in the past. There are only three things in life guaranteed: paying taxes, changes to tax laws, and of course, death. We just don't know when it's going to occur or how it's going to occur. Will our spouse become terminally ill, or will we become terminally ill? And, we're given a specific timeline. Or is it going to be something very abrupt and abrasive, right? Where it's, someone's coming home from work and there's an accident and now they're no longer here with us. The one thing that I've often been told while being brought up was just make sure your bags are always packed, right? And there's different ways that you can interpret that, whether it's from a spiritual perspective, whether it's from a financial perspective, whether it's just from a relationship perspective. So in this episode, we're going to be tilting or leaning more so into the financial realm of things, of course, with this being a personal finance podcast. So I am excited, but more so for the good that this episode can offer, even though it is a pretty morbid one.
Who would you say from a listener standpoint this episode is probably best for?
Yeah, I would say that it's really best for two camps. So if you are someone who are experiencing becoming a newfound widow, widower, this episode's for you. First and foremost, our deepest condolences for you and your family and your loved ones, if this is what you're experiencing right now. The other camp is going to be the couples who want to proactively make sure that the planning that they're doing in their personal world will make the first 6 months after a spouse's death easier, not more complex, and not more difficult.
Got it. So essentially those who might be worried what happens when one of us potentially becomes a widow, because as you mentioned before, it's unknown when, but everyone knows that death is unavoidable. So let's jump into our discussion here. And I think the first part of our discussion is generally around how to think, what to do, how to approach what a passing might look like in those first 6 months. So for that first camp, I'm a new widow or widower. I've got a lot of things that I'm looking to really figure out and tackle, or perhaps I'm not a widower yet, but I'm in this position where I'm worried, what are those first 6 months going to look like for me? Talk to us about the experience that you've seen or some of the more financial driven advice that you provide or help clients with.
Yeah, so I would say in the first 6 months that it's very much encouraged that this is the best time to actually do nothing, right? Very seldomly do we say that doing nothing is the right answer, but in this case, it actually is. Why? Because there are a lot of emotions going on. There is a lot of grief that is taking place, and there is going to be a lot asked of you as a surviving spouse. I've never personally lost a spouse, so I can't tell you that I've been through that specifically, but from what I've witnessed as a third party to the situation, I can tell you that there's a lot going on. You have to basically continue to maneuver and manage the current state of your world, right? Whether you're in a career, whether you have young children, while also trying to make sense of what just occurred, especially if it was unexpected or untimely, while also trying to unpack and unravel the personal financial situation of the deceased spouse. So there are going to be conversations with attorneys. There are going to be conversations with funeral homes. There are going to be conversations with children and parents and, relatives, with the deceased spouse's former employer. If the deceased spouse had student loans or credit cards or whatever, you're now having to unravel and unpack everything that they have or had going on in their world, and you may not have been privy to all of it. And if they weren't very good at keeping shared documents or shared passwords, well, that's the biggest hurdle that a lot of surviving spouses actually go through is, okay, well, how do I now gain access to this person's bank account, investment account, retirement account, student loan portal, social media pages, like all these different things. And there's going to be a ton of paperwork that has to be filled out, all while you are having to manage and captain the grief and emotions that you're feeling. And of course, most of us are probably going to try to keep it buttoned up to make it look like we're not just distraught inside, if that makes sense.
At least on the outside. Yep, I would say the experience that I've had, again, never losing a spouse, but seeing or working with individuals who have become now widows, widowers. Emotions are heightened. Everything that you've just described, the word that I oftentimes use or feel that I see most often is just overwhelmed. Life is now just a huge, quote unquote, mess that needs to be organized, needs to be addressed and tackled. And there's obviously strategy that goes into a lot of these financial decisions. But a lot of the experience that clients have initially is, hey, I'm just wildly overwhelmed and it's difficult for me to figure out where to get started and what step comes next. And what you and I well know in the financial world or in the world of financial decision-making quality typically declines in periods of high emotions, high stress, time crunches. So from an encouragement standpoint, the conversations that we're having with clients say this feeling of being overwhelmed is quite normal. And the strong recommendation, if not just encouragement that we're giving clients is, hey, take a moment to pause. Right? There are some things that need to be tackled on a more urgent type of time-sensitive type of basis, but there are plenty of things that we absolutely have more than enough time for you to process emotions and begin to unwind what is a spouse's financial world before making a fear-based decision or perhaps letting your emotions take control of the decisions that you're making.
Yeah, because I imagine, and from what I've witnessed, that sense of urgency is real. And I would say that some of that's just due because of the numbness or the cognitive fog that occurs with this new event, right? Most of us won't experience it, but for the first time when it actually occurs, losing a loved one, someone who's very near and dear to us and directly integrated into our personal and financial worlds, right? So, I mean, you're spot on. I mean, I would say the quality of the decisions that are going to occur within the first 6 to 9 months post passing of the loved one is really what can, I won't necessarily say make or break the financial success moving forward. But again, I will continue to harp on the fact that what will the first 6 months after the passing of your spouse look like? Most of us would hopefully want that to be as seamless and simple and easy as possible for our surviving spouse, just because we know how much this is going to impact them, right?
So let's start to talk about that, because what I think you and I have really garnered up to this point is in the early stages of a loss. It's one of the few times where doing nothing is actually a viable strategy, right? At least initially, to let things settle and your emotions really begin to calm. But from an actual action standpoint, once we have the proper amount of time to begin to make decisions without as much emotions charging the types of decisions that we're making, what are some of those things that need to be addressed first, or where might widowers start to look first in this mountain of financial mess that someone may have to unwind?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, the immediate actions that need to be addressed are going to be more administrative and not strategic in nature. So things like obtaining a death certificate and having copies of it, whether it needs to be certified copies or just digital copies, is really going to be dependent on who we're sending those death certificates to, right? So think about banks, insurance companies to be able to file claims on life insurance, being able to notify Social Security that your spouse has passed away and whether or not there's any sort of benefits that you or a young child may be eligible for, as well as updating account registrations. Again, if you're in the camp currently to where you and your spouse bank separately because of just your own personal bias or beliefs and how you guys want to manage your money, that is a pretty difficult circumstance in many instances for the surviving spouse. It's going to require a couple hoops and hurdles that you have to jump through or jump over just for the surviving spouse to gain access. So this is where, in working with your financial advisor, making sure that, appropriate titling on the account registrations is done so that it's, again, a seamless transition of access for the surviving spouse. But then also outsourcing and leaning on your financial advisor if you have an existing relationship. There are many instances where only one spouse is actually proactively engaged in the financial advising relationship. So it could be that the spouse that passed away was the one that handled everything, and the surviving spouse is one that's kind of chosen to not be as engaged because of, how they've divided up the overall household responsibilities. And so now it's, well, I don't know how to do any of this. I wasn't in the fold. So then you really have to lean into the advisor relationship who's hopefully been there along the way.
Yep, and that would be the general encouragement, especially coming from a planning type of lens, is if you and your spouse, whether it's been joint or perhaps more on an individual basis, have worked with someone whom one of the two of you or both of the two of you know, trust, understand, is really helping with what's going on, they're a resource, right? Just as any family member could be from an emotional standpoint, your financial planner or your financial advisor can be a resource for you to lean on to help begin to tackle the administrative tasks, to really outsource the bigger picture strategic decision making, taking a lot of the emotions out of that stuff. So what I'm hearing from you is there are a number of small wins, I'll put in quotation marks, that people can begin to tackle slowly that don't require a lot of big decisions or high emotion decisions. And then there are resources that hopefully clients have at their fingertips to lean on when it's time or as needed through that process.
One encouragement that we can offer is that, I guess, a couple, but the first one being, as a financial advisory team, we highly encourage that both spouses be at least engaged throughout the course of the year in some of our consultations, right? If one of the spouses doesn't want to be in every single meeting that we have, that's perfectly fine. But there should be at least one meeting a year where it's like, hey, it's like a board meeting. All board members need to be a part of this, right? Husband and wife, spouses, you're both board members, right, of your household, financial household. So at least once a year. Second, having really good documentation of where you guys are keeping your login credentials for the different banks, websites, social media, emails, all that stuff. And managing it prudently with, date stamps on when passwords were last updated or which sites are no longer in use. And it's really just a matter of making the first 6 months, even the first 9 months, as easy as possible for the surviving spouse. So we've talked about the immediate actions that need to be taken. And again, in our minds, it's more administrative, not strategic. Brady, I'm curious, what can actually wait?
So the things that I typically suggest that clients wait before making large changes or decisions regarding is typically more of the, I would say, true planning strategy decisions that one or both spouses have made up to this point in time. What are examples of that, right? The first example may be the type of investments that we're using or the investment allocation that we currently have, right? If we have a financial plan in place, that financial plan more than likely has this idea that one spouse is eventually going to be left as the surviving spouse. And in many instances, when spouse number one passes, the plan is not to completely revamp or redevelop everything the very next day.
Correct.
More often than not, it's, hey, this was already built or baked into the plan in some capacity. Let's tackle some of these administrative tasks. Let's give ourselves some time to basically reevaluate what life looks like, let emotions calm down, and then let's see if there's any investment changes needed whatsoever. Right? I never want to rush clients into a change that's going to wildly impact what their immediate financial situation, tax situation might look like, or what their longer term financial situation might look like just because we're emotionally charged now.
Yeah, and I would say that's where a lot of common mistakes are actually made, is in the areas that you just mentioned that we believe can actually be postponed or delayed decision making wise, right? It's usually the mistakes of selling investments at the wrong time. And a lot of that is usually driven from overreacting to fear-based advice that's usually provided by friends and family.
Yep. Oh, it's time to get out of the market, right? You just lost your spouse and the market may not be doing so great. Okay, well, let's talk about that. There are some more important things that we can consider. It's very valid that you may be feeling more worried than you have in the past, but our financial plans have not changed, right? This has been part of it all along the way, and we still have a runway that we're walking down, and there are things to figure out before we just completely revamp the financial plan.
Yeah, and that's an actually interesting part, the financial plan to emphasize, right? This is what we've been building. I'd like to think of it more so as like a game plan for a sporting event. In every game plan that you go, at least I remember when I played lacrosse in college, that we would always have a walkthrough the day before a game. Most teams will have a walkthrough of sorts, and that's what you're ultimately doing or should be doing with your financial plan. You should be stress testing it and identifying as many different risks as possible that can occur along the way, even if we think that the probability of the event arising is actually very minimal or close to non-existent. We still want to stress test the plan. Why? Because of the what if moments that we have zero control over. Like, that is the whole point of doing financial planning. It's not to build a investment portfolio that's going to offer high returns year over year. Yes, that's a component of it. It's a complement of the plan. But the plan is really to make sure that, hey, how will life look if X, Y, and Z occurs now, in 5 years, 15 years, or 30 years? What if it never occurs? Well, great. The plan's perfect then.
Yeah.
Right? Or as close to perfect as possible. So this, at least segment of today's episode, is really focused on separating paperwork urgency from actual financial strategy urgency, because it's not one and the same. And I would say the immediate administrative focal needs are more of the paperwork urgency.
Yeah, and I love how you use the analogy from a sports perspective is the reason you and your coach and your team are doing the walkthrough is, in most circumstances, not to visualize or imagine everything going 100% exactly as planned and you win by 100 goals at the end of the game, right? The reason for the walkthrough is to basically work through what happens if we're down, right? What happens if we lose a player of ours? What happens if we see something unexpected from the other team? What happens if we get surprised while we're out there on the field? And that's really the effort of, hey, what can wait or where can we pause? It's making long-term financial decisions or changing long-term financial plans. That may include completely revamping what our investments look like, rushing to sell a piece of real estate that has no need or reason to be sold, completely revamping how we're addressing taxes. It's all of that big picture stuff that we should have had a walkthrough already. If we haven't had a walkthrough, let's go find a resource or someone who can help walk us through it.
And to button up this, at least, segment before we move on to the next piece, it brings up this quote, a very well-known quote from Mike Tyson. It's, everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth or the face. And again, he's a famous, one of the greatest boxers. So of course, the quote's a little more direct, but that's what life is doing. It's punching you in the face, it's punching you in the mouth. And now we're having to react to it. So, do we truly have a game plan for this, or are we going to be making something up on the fly? And I think that's when a lot of mistakes can occur.
It's a good segment into where we're headed next. It's basically the role that walk-through type of pre-plan really builds. So talk to us more when it comes to making your surviving spouses or future surviving spouses' life simpler. What are some things that clients can talk about, begin to work on, or take action on today that make a lot of that first 6 months just notably easier or more clear on, hey, where we go from here when this happens?
The most simplest area to start in would be, and this is usually one of our first areas of our triage process, is really around cash flow planning. And what I mean by that is not so much the cash flow itself, but the accounts and registrations that we're using where cash flow is going to be going. And so, one, does it make sense for accounts to be consolidated? Instead of both spouses having bank accounts all over different banking institutions in their own names, does it make sense to consolidate, which eliminates the complexity of having things scattered? I'm of the camp that yes, once we get married, consolidating a lot of our accounts makes a whole lot of sense. There could be use cases and scenarios where that doesn't make sense, right? It's not a one size fits all. But typically consolidation is a simpler path, right? And if we're not going to do that, then making sure that there's a transfer on death or a paid on death type of registration for any sort of individually owned accounts. Same concept with retirement accounts. If my spouse or I have had a lot of different forms of employment and we have a bunch of different retirement accounts out there, there's really no need, in my opinion, to leave them scattered all over the place. Go ahead and start consolidating your old 401ks, 403bs, rolling them into each other to just consolidate it and simplify it.
At least initially, right? Because we have this experience with clients, and I think a lot of clients don't understand the complexity or maybe even the challenge that this poses. For every retirement account that a client has at a different institution, that's another phone call that your spouse has to make. It's another 1-800 number, phone tree that they have to work through. It's a new random representative that they never met that they're speaking to in a completely different process every time.
It's new paperwork that you're having to submit with supporting documentation that you probably are the surviving spouse and that your spouse has passed away, right?
Yep. Like one of those phone calls can take the entire day, right? Between front to back in what you're doing. So like if you have 6 different retirement accounts, like that's 6 days worth of work for your surviving spouse to work through all of those details.
Best case scenario. Yeah. And again, if you're a spouse who, with one of these accounts, your name hadn't changed, right? You get married and you change your maiden name. Well, that's an even bigger problem because before you can actually consolidate it and roll it out, well, they're going to need a name change form.
Yep.
Right. So how do you get all that situated? I mean, it's a big headache. Doing that while both parties are healthy and living is a headache enough. I can't imagine doing it when one of the spouses is no longer around and it's their account. Make sure that you understand beneficiary designations and assignments. With where society is today, my opinion is that a lot of young professionals are starting to delay getting married and starting their lives. Some of that could be driven based off of going and getting higher education after an undergraduate. Some of it is really just wanting to make sure that you have your financial household in order before joining yourself to someone else. Whatever the reason, your beneficiary assignments may be different from when you first started working in a career to when you got married. So making sure that your beneficiary designations are up to date and at least being reviewed once a year, just to make sure that no modifications need to be changed. And then actual documented financial plan. Now, when I hear the word documented, it doesn't need to be the traditional, 100-page binder with printouts of a financial plan. I don't think that that's necessarily needed. And if anything, you and I are more of the camp of, the one-page financial plan. Something that's concise and very simple to break down what are we working on, what do we have, and what are our milestones that we're targeting. And that's where having that proactive ongoing relationship with your financial advisor, financial professional is very fruitful or can be fruitful in this scenario. Is because you want at least some sort of audit trail of this is where we started, this is where we're at, and this is what we're targeting, or this is what we're heading towards. Because if something happens, you want to be made aware. One thing that I really like that we offer a lot of our clients is a packet known as a letter for my loved ones. And it's basically a PDF worksheet where you can work through filling out who all the advisors are in your household's relationship, whether it's property and casualty, whether it's attorney, whether it's CPA, whether it's financial advisor, investment manager, whatever it might be. You can list them out with their contact information. You can include a login and password page with all the different sites that you want to make sure the other, the surviving spouse has access to. And you can also include an actual letter to them written in the form as if you were saying goodbye. Now, you're obviously doing this while you're healthy and while you're still living. And so it's really, to use a very cliche word, it's very sweet in nature because you're providing all this in advance for your surviving spouse in the event that something occurs. It almost reminds me of the movie, and I hate that I'm even saying this, but the movie P.S. I Love You.
So
Have you ever seen that movie?
I haven't seen that, but I'm not as much of a movie person as you are, but
it's a very good movie. That's a movie you need to go watch.
Okay. No, but I like how you mentioned that letter to your spouse or that love letter to your spouse. And what I would expect kind of goes in that letter from your encouragement is here's all of the actual data and the resources, the logins that you need to look through, the contacts that you might need to discuss different pieces with. Here may be a piece of the letter, who to talk to, in what order, what to actually do if you're especially the spouse who handles more of the financial picture. And then, of course, on the back end of that, right, when we're writing it, when we're healthy, perhaps a little bit younger, here's the I love you part of that letter as well. So it can serve a multifaceted purpose, but I think the summary is prior planning can make a pretty big impact just in really making that first 6-month period when pressure and stress is normally really high, can make that impact much, much easier if you've done your due diligence in understanding what your financial world, your financial MRI looks like, and you've made an effort to actually get organized and put a plan in place.
Right. I would say one thing that we didn't necessarily touch on, but like this is where the power of estate planning really comes into play. Like estate planning in my mind is really like pre-death planning. And you're going to do estate planning ongoing at various phases, whether it's the accumulation phase, whether it's the capital preservation phase when you get into, your late 40s, late 50s, and then of course your spending phase, your distribution phase when you're actually in retirement. You're going to continue to review it, monitor it, or at least you very much should be doing that. It doesn't have to be overly complex, but good planning in general isn't about efficiency and optimization. Right? I think that's too cliche. It's really about reducing decision-making fatigue during the hardest seasons of someone's life. That's applicable across those 3 phases we just talked about: accumulation, capital preservation, and distribution.
So, Michael, I'd say that's actually a fair transition point here, right? Building the absolute best, most optimized plan, that's something we're always chasing. But in this type of planning, as you mentioned, it's just reducing the amount of decisions and having to figure out those decisions that make the biggest impact. Now, as we begin to work towards that 6 to 18 month period after a passing, where we've tackled a lot of the administrative, the paperwork, the easy wins, we've given ourselves some time to really process how we feel emotionally and what decisions we might really need to start thinking about. We've leaned on the prior planning that we've done and the resources that we have in a professional or an advisor type of relationship. Let's talk about some of the actual strategy decisions that widowers really need to begin to consider, or at least begin to impact their world after that initial period of loss.
If we focus primarily on just cash flow issues, I think that's where it's all going to start, because cash flow drives everything. So I guess the big question is, will your cash flow needs actually change? Right? And that's just a very simple and direct question. And if so, then it's a matter of, okay, well, now we need to develop a new income and expense plan. Before we can make any decisions around reallocations of investments or downsizing, moving, transition, whatever it might be, we first need to figure out, well, what's the new cash flow need? And we know that there's going to be income disruption because of, and I guess it really just depends, correct me if I'm wrong, at what age this is actually occurring. If it's occurring to mid 30-year-olds, there's probably a lot of disruption cash flow wise, versus if you're already retired with a income distribution plan already designed. Yes, there will be some cash flow disruption, but hopefully less disruptive, right? Because of the proactive planning that's been done for both parties. Now, one of the things that you might miss out on or that will adjust is obviously Social Security benefits, because while both spouses are on Social Security, there's 2 benefits coming in, but when one spouse dies, the smaller benefit is what goes away. The larger benefit sticks around and stays. Pension benefits.
That impact with Social Security can look very different just depending on how large or how big or small each Social Security benefit is.
What that spread actually looks like. Yep. And whether, there was a very tactical approach to designing when to turn it on for each spouse. Pension benefits. When you were turning on your pension benefit, did you select single life? Did you select joint survivor? I mean, what did you actually choose? And is your surviving spouse aware of what you chose? Because I've actually had scenarios where I'm working with a widow and she was not aware that her husband had chosen a single life payout. And this was somebody that I had inherited as a client. So I wasn't even there for the ongoing consultations. And again, she was kind of flabbergasted. It's like, hey, I had no idea that he did this.
And that is especially prevalent in a second marriage. Oftentimes, hey, I have elected my pension choices, my Social Security choices without really thinking through another person, because at that time, perhaps I did not have a partner or I was going through a separation of some kind, and then I get remarried later. We're living off into our retirement years, and all of those decisions have been made, but my now new partner or spouse was not privy to those just because our plans were built at different times or in different contexts.
And in this specific scenario, if I come back to the client that I had inherited, I remember the surviving spouse telling me, well, they always thought that they would outlive me, that they would be the one to die last. And so that very much drove the decision that they made. And so that's where I think we as the practitioners have to step in and stress test the heck out of that. What happens if you don't outlive your spouse? And how does that impact the financial realm of this decision? So again, income disruption, need for liquidity. Don't make it over complex. What do we have by way of funds that are accessible today to where, for at least the next 6 months, we don't have to make a drastic financial decision? We're trying to create a buffer of 6 months. And it's actually, I won't say comical in nature, but when you're in the accumulation phase, we often say about 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses set aside in cash, right? Because if you lose a job, that is a disruptor to your cash flow. You want to be able to not be forced to make a drastic and emotional, urgent financial decision, and we want to be able to buy you time. Well, same concept on the distribution side of things, which is hopefully most of our listeners are going to have a long and healthy life, which is why we're tilting into that. But again, that 6-month buffer of liquidity is a good measure. And as your wealth continues to grow and accumulate and you're hitting extraordinary wealth building status, maybe the liquidity pushes up to 1 year's worth of lifestyle need. And it's just a matter of how do we allocate that liquidity?
Let's talk about that a little bit more, because I think this is probably the biggest key, especially when it comes to how emotions drive decisions. Right? What we've talked about up to this point is I've spent the first 6 months of being a widow really working through more administrative tasks and processing things emotionally. At this point, 6 months have gone by and I've lost a Social Security benefit. I've been reduced or lost pension benefits. My cash flow has notably changed. And right when it's time to begin to make big financial or strategic decisions, my income is lower and I need cash, right? Because now I'm really starting to restart what my life looks like. If all of my investments, if all of my assets are extremely illiquid, I don't mean to pick on anyone here, but our real estate investors is really where this, I think, becomes most prevalent, is now all of a sudden, if I don't have enough liquidity or I do not have enough cash to make strategic financial decisions, I'm either going to make an emotional one or I'm going to be forced to make perhaps the best decision in a bad moment, right? Selling in a poor market, leaning into an asset or leveraging an asset when it puts things at risk.
Yeah, the leveraging the asset in my mind is, of course, taking on unnecessary debts just to be able to put a Band-Aid over the situation. And then having that debt creates even more stress and anxiety when you're probably used to not having much at all in that circumstance.
So that liquidity, I think, is actually a huge one. Like, we are absolutely going to have to plan or figure out how to fix an income disruption problem. But oftentimes the easiest solution to lean on to make the better long-term solution is going to be either having liquidity built into our plan already or having a solution that provides liquidity upon a passing, right? Life insurance is an example.
Yep. It's all about those buffer assets. And again, as we're building our financial fortress, our financial fortitude, we need to have a moat, and it's going to be buffer assets that buy us time. And then, of course, as we're talking about cash flow for the surviving spouse and how important it is, just understanding emergency reserves, predictable income streams, and like you mentioned, avoiding those forced asset sales. But more importantly, what are the tax implications of what's just occurred? Like, there is something known as the widow's tax. So Brady, why don't you break that down for us?
So the widow's tax is not actually anything that changes in tax law. It's the simple nature of moving from married filing jointly status to future single filing status. Now, we live in a marginal tax environment. So as your income rises, that income is slowly taxed at higher rates as it increases. Now, those marginal thresholds for married individuals are just naturally and notably higher than those thresholds for single individuals. So if I'm a married filing joint couple and I make $200,000 per year, I may fall somewhere in the neighborhood of that 22 or that 24% tax bracket. If I am a single filer, more of my income is going to be pushed up into that 22 and that 24% tax bracket if I'm making that same amount of income. So what does the widow's tax actually look and feel like for a surviving spouse? It's I'm making or I'm consuming the exact same, if not nearly the same amount of income as I was when my spouse was here, but I'm paying notably more in taxes. And what does that lead to? It's a cash flow problem. I have lost my surviving spouse's Social Security benefit, and I am paying more in taxes. My cash flow is being pulled down significantly more than I expected. And the only reason is because now I'm a single filer. Right? It's that unfortunate nature of just how our marginal tax rates work and what we call widow's tax for the surviving spouse.
And so then there is necessary timing that needs to be considered in that first year, correct, is what I'm hearing?
Yep. And again, this is where the answer here is it always depends, right? At what point in the year is your spouse passed? How much time should we really be waiting or leaning on before we make big financial decisions? Do we have a partner, a professional in our world who can really help guide decisions? Because, right, we just said, let's not make any notable tax changes a couple of moments ago. And now we're saying, hey, there could be a notable tax impact here. But as an example, if I have a spouse passes away in February or March, and I have begun to tackle the administrative tasks, I've leaned on a professional to help begin to guide bigger decisions, I'm in a place where I can comfortably and confidently make choices. In September, October, November, it may make sense for me to actually accelerate pre-tax IRA distributions from an income standpoint to capture those distributions at a lower tax rate in that year where I'm still allowed to file as a joint spouse. Because next year when I file as a single spouse, if I try to take that same money out, I'm going to pay more taxes on those dollars. In theory, it's just accelerating pre-tax distributions or accelerating income in years where your tax rates are most favorable, trying to avoid that widow's tax later.
Got you. And just to clarify, that's primarily focused on an individual who is in a retirement distribution phase of life.
Yes.
You may not necessarily need to lean into that type of strategy if you're, in your mid 30s or 40s prior to age 59 and a half.
Could be applicable, right? Would it make sense for a 38-year-old to take from an IRA if they've lost their spouse?
If the liquidity's not there.
Yeah, if the liquidity's not there, it certainly could make sense, and it would also make sense in that case to consider taking funds out before you go into single filing status. Now you're going to get penalized either way because you're under 59 and a half. But yeah, if the liquidity's not there, could make sense. But more often than not, it's, hey, we're in distribution phase and we're naturally taking from our accounts regardless. Let's consider an acceleration here.
Got you. Now, as we wrap up this portion of the episode and we're talking about cash flow, right, and how important it is, the last piece that's going to need to be at least considered is just re-examining the annuities, right, your income sources if you're in the distribution phase, having those recurring income sources coming in, that predictable income. And I would even say your life insurance contracts from a cash flow perspective. And now, how does the life insurance fit into that? Well, let's take someone who's in their mid-30s, husband and wife, and they have a child that's very young. If one of the spouses passes away, well, now there's even higher risk in that household for the single surviving parent for that child. So there is likely going to be a need for them to increase their death benefit coverage. By doing so, that impacts the cash flow. So this is more of a statement of the camp of you're going to have an inherently higher cash flow need, potentially, because you're going to be taking on additional death benefit coverage to be able to insulate the situation, right? Because again, you're the now sole breadwinner, surviving spouse, and taking care of your dependent child. So if something happens to you next, while they're still minor, then there's, again, potentially financial hardship. So just keeping that in mind. And this is where, from a 5-pillar planning process or triage process, where the incorporation of just understanding your cash flow comes into play, but also building in that wealth building account, that surge protector for clients so that we know, or you know, exactly what's flowing in and how it's being allocated across your balance sheet in the most impactful and purpose-driven way. So Brady, let's move on to really, I guess, the last phase. So we've talked about the first 6 to 9 months, things that need to be considered or addressed, things that are more urgent in theory, and things that can be slowed down or delayed. Let's talk about the next, let's call it 9 to 18 months. What are the thoughtful, values-based decisions that should be considered for the surviving spouse?
So, Michael, it's an interesting question the way you ask it, because the first 6 months are very, what tasks do I need to accomplish, and how do I really begin to fix a lot of a potential mess or execute on a lot of the plan that my spouse has left behind for me. The next 6 to 9 to 12 months could be nothing more than, what decisions do I need to make to optimize any strategy that I can, being a widow at this point. I think after we get past the 9-month, the 18-month, that timeline is going to look very different from everyone. The focus shifts away from, what do I have to accomplish? What strategy decisions can I make? And shifts towards, what is my life going to look like in this new norm as a widow moving forward? And I think this is where, from a financial planning standpoint, the focus now reshifts, right? The lens reshifts to surviving spouse and saying, hey, what direction are you headed from a life's purpose standpoint now that your spouse is no longer here, right? What's going to be most important to you? Is it supporting family that's still around? Is it leaving a legacy to a cause that you feel is important, or other family members that are in your world? Is it really living your life to the maximum, even though your spouse isn't there to live it alongside of you in their memory or in their support? So this is where the conversation really begins to shift more towards, what is life going to look like and what's most important for you? And I would say the goal in this phase is not just simply, hey, we want to move on financially. It's, we want to move forward with intentionality. And then, what do the financial components of that intentionality actually look like?
No, I love that. And I would say that it's very similar to when you first sit down with your financial advisor as spouses. There's a values conversation that's being had. There's a goals and concerns conversation that's being had. It's them getting to understand who you guys are, what motivates you, the intricacies of your thinking process, right? And again, your perspective on giving, legacy, and supporting loved ones. Now, after the first 6 to 9 months of your spouse passing away, it's almost having those exact same conversations all over again, because now it's no longer a co-act theme. It's now a single performer, right? A solo act, potentially. And why shouldn't your life moving forward be just as enjoyable as it was prior to the event? Like, I tell all of my clients that the planning that I'm doing for my family is very similar to the planning that we're coaching our clients through. And if I get called off this earth at any given moment, I don't want my surviving spouse's life to have to shift drastically. I want it to continue on. I want them to continue to do the things that we had dreamed on doing together. Right? Those goals don't just go away. Now, they may not be able to execute them in the same manner by way of me being there with them, but it's a matter of those values that you guys shared don't just dissipate into the air just because one of you is no longer here. And so I think it's very important to emphasize that, yes, life does go on. It's important to at least acknowledge that, and it will take time, and there may need to be some help with, counseling, therapy sessions, whatever it might be, depending on the circumstances. But it is okay for you to continue to enjoy life. And in most cases, from the experiences I've had with clients that this type of scenario has arisen in their world, they really just want to be great stewards of the finances that they're inheriting from their deceased spouse moving forward. They want to make the deceased spouse proud, especially if they were the ones that were not making the financial decisions in the household as far as like managing them.
And I think that's things we hear very often. It's like, hey, I want to make sure I don't blow this.
Yeah.
Right? And that may or may not be the best attitude to take into it, but at the end of the day, it's, hey, I want to be the best possible steward or continue the legacy that my surviving spouse was building right alongside of me, even if he or she is not there any longer to help support it. And I think that's where, from a process-driven standpoint, working with a resource, a partner, a planner, advisor who can lean into a process makes it easier for surviving spouse to have that values-driven conversation. And then really the next step is, how does all of those values and that type of conversation translate into the action that we need to take? It's going to look similar, whether it's both spouses sitting in the room or now surviving spouse only. Let's reevaluate from a cash flow perspective. What does our new life look like? What do we want it to look like to be the best steward of the dollars that we've inherited? What do the assets that we've now inherited or now become available upon a passing? What do they look like? How do they work together? How do we need to actually put them to work to grow for us going forward? What protections do we now have to put in place ourselves when it comes to continuing this idea of planning? Do we need to now update our own estate documents so our kids don't run into the same challenges that you may have just run into? Do we need to go out and buy more insurance if we're the accumulator client who's lost a spouse more prematurely than a distribution client? And then how are we using debt as a tool? How is everything being coordinated together to continue to live that same legacy and live up to the values that you're having those discussions about? So the process, being able to lean on one, makes the planning, both pre-passing and post-passing, much easier to really step into with confidence.
And so, Brady, if there's one takeaway from today, it's that you don't need to have all the answers right away.
And more importantly, you shouldn't feel pressure to make big financial decisions in the middle of grief.
Correct. The best financial plans are the ones that create clarity and simplicity when life gets complicated.
And if you're listening to this and thinking, I want to make sure my spouse is taken care of no matter what, that's the exact kind of planning we help families build every day.
And as always, if you found this helpful, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who may need it.
And if you have questions or want us to cover a specific topic or dive deeper, head over to www.genesiswealthplanning.com/AMA. And we'll see you next time on Financial Fortitude. Are you considering hiring a financial advisor? If so, be sure to listen to episode 1 of Financial Fortitude. In this episode, we discuss the reasons why many people choose to hire a financial advisor and highlight the key qualities you should look for in the financial professional you decide to work with.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not to be construed as tax, legal, or investment advice. Although the information has been gathered from sources believed to be reliable, please note that individual situations can vary. Therefore, the information should be relied upon only when coordinated with individual professional advice. Guest speakers and their firms are not affiliated with or endorsed by Park Avenue Securities, Guardian, or Genesis Wealth Planning LLC, and opinions stated are their own. Guardian, its subsidiaries, agents, and employees do not provide tax, legal, or accounting advice. Consult your tax, legal, or accounting professional regarding your individual situation. All investments and investment strategies contain risk and may lose value. All scenarios and names mentioned herein are purely fictional and have been created solely for educational purposes. Any resemblance to existing situations, persons, or fictional characters is coincidental. The information presented should not be used as the basis for any specific investment advice. Michael Acosta and Brady Hammerly are registered representatives and financial advisors of Park Avenue Securities, LLC, PAS. Securities, products, and advisory services offered through Park Avenue Securities, member FINRA, SIPC. Financial representatives of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, New York, New York. Park Avenue Securities is a wholly owned subsidiary of Guardian. Consolidated Planning Group, Inc. and Genesis Wealth Planning, LLC are not affiliates or subsidiaries of Park Avenue Securities or Guardian. Michael Acosta's California Insurance License Number 0M50974 and Brady Hammerly's California Insurance License Number 4353077. 7237198.35, expiration 428.